What's very interesting about this book, you sort of, I think when an author writes a book, especially like somebody like Master, often there's an integrity to it that you don't exactly realize yourself. You just put things together. So Master gives us all of these prayers, and last week, and we'll talk a little more this week, we talked a little bit about the challenge of saying, I care not whether I suffer and everything is taken away from me. Pam, I love you're so expressive. Just a little turn of the eyebrow. Just sort of showing me that sounds good, but let's hope we get there someday. I care not whether everything is taken away from me as long as I love God. But he also gives us help, sort of how to realize that. And one of the, because there's some essays in here that are extremely good, and at the beginning of the class series I read from one, and there's another one in here called Watching the Cosmic Motion Picture of Life. And this is just absolutely full of just pure pearls for just helping us to keep our perspective. Not only is it very deep philosophically, but it's kind of written as if it were a movie. I mean, he writes it with this kind of entertaining, slightly tongue-in-cheek manner, just helping us to feel I think it must have been a great day for spiritual teachers when movies were invented, because all of a sudden there's such an absolutely irrefutable image in front of us that explains what's going on in the world within us. That's why Kali Yuga was harder, because the consciousness wasn't subtle enough to grasp that this world is a movie. There was no concept of this world being a movie because there was no concept of a movie. I mean, it's a sort of a silly thought, but it's really true. Swamiji, when he was talking about the book about William and Henry, about William the Conqueror having been Yogananda in a previous life, Kriyananda himself being William's son Henry. And he was trying to explain that in Kali Yuga, just all the consciousness was extremely different. We have so many things that we just take for granted today, that people in all countries are essentially the same, that religions all lead to the same goal, that life itself, that death is a transition of energy, that energy and consciousness are really the key. In those days, everything was so material, people just really couldn't imagine beyond the material. The Pope was completely in charge of everything, and when you wanted to prove your loyalty to the Catholic Church and the loyalty to God, you built a church. Everything had to be physically done. And now, in Dwapara Yuga, we're able to just think so much in terms of everything being a flow, and life being a flow, and even our own individual consciousness being a flow. So I was trying to just explain just how it feels so differently. We can live so much more lightly. I mean, even just the way life itself manifests. I was thinking just about America. We live so comfortably. We have so much food. We have so many choices. We move around in comfortable cars. We go long distances. We have all these machines to work with. And I mean, even now on this planet, there's so many parts of the planet where people just struggle so hard just against the physical plane. I was reading the book by the woman from Rwanda, Immaculée, I think her name is, beautiful. She's written 2 beautiful books. She talked about coming from Rwanda after the genocide and coming to America finally. She just wasn't safe for her to stay in Rwanda. She just had to leave the country 4 years after the genocide ended because there was still too much violence and she became a target. But she talks about shopping at Costco and being able to buy a single can of beans. She said that would have fed a Rwandan family for 1 week. Just the whole complete difference of reality, even as we live now. Now, coming back to where I was really talking about, Master uses this image that life is a cosmic motion picture. And this essay has in it the line that I'd first heard Haridas say, and I didn't realize it was from this book. I first heard Haridas say this decades ago. He made the statement that Master makes here, that if a movie is made of your life, it will last about 2 hours. And it's such an interesting way to think about it. And the way Haridas put it is sometimes when he's in like a really difficult part, he thinks, maybe this will get as long as 4 minutes in the movie of my life. And when you sort of say it like that, it all of a sudden just puts every experience into a certain perspective, doesn't it? I read once in some book, I've always enjoyed reading, well, I've been drawn to read true stories of people facing difficulties heroically. And one of the stories I read was about a man who was kidnapped, I think, in somewhere in the Mideast. Was held for 7 years. I think it was Terry Anderson. I think he was a reporter. Very interesting book. 7 years he was held as a hostage there. But he recalls that he had heard someone say earlier that if you find yourself in a very difficult situation, these were prisoners of war talking. He said it may help to start writing your autobiography, in which this is only one portion of the story. And so I often, myself, it's what I consider the caption technique for dealing with the experiences of your life. And you write a caption for this picture. This is the point in the story in which the heroine was struggling against great sense of discouragement. And then you imagine a little picture of the heroine looking quite discouraged. And the obvious thing is that on the next page, there's a picture of her after she's triumphed over those difficult circumstances and is now feeling her normal, buoyant self again. But it's anything that causes us to have just that slightly impersonal attitude where we can just see it running instead of seeing it happening to us. Everything is about whether it's happening to us. Because the fact of the matter is, these things do happen. It's just a question of to whom they are happening. Who's home to have it happen? Is anybody like gathering all that stuff into themselves, or is it just running through us? There's center everywhere. There's no edge to this, it just flows through. So I wanted to sort of just comment on a few parts out of this before we do some more whispers. He says, I love the way he put this, the inspiring movies, he talks about how movies, some are informative, some are simply delightful, some give us information that we ponder very deeply. I mean, he's just talking about all the events that happen in our lives by calling them movies. Sad movies lead us slowly by the hand to the portals of reflection. Isn't that so? I mean, how often is it that unless our system crashes in on itself, we never stop and ask the fundamental question, which is this really working for me? I was just talking to someone facing difficulties not too long ago, and I mean, it's just obvious that when we work under fundamental wrong assumptions, that sooner or later those wrong assumptions will cause everything to go wrong. And it can take us a week, it can take us an incarnation, it can take us 10 incarnations. It's just when we begin to experience difficulties and sadness, what kind of question do we ask? So he says it leads us to the portals of reflection. And then he says the inspiring movies lead us into the garden of higher reflection, where we learn to hope for better things in life than endlessly pulling up the weeds of troubles in hope of making life trouble-free. And then he says it so sweetly, the hope that dawns on us is that there may be lofty regions of consciousness where not only rest, but enduring love and bliss are possible. Now, I love the progression that he describes there, because at first, the only thing we hope for is a cessation of suffering. And a lot of people, that's sort of how they get to when they get to the end of their life. The only thing they really want is for it to be over. They're no longer actually thinking that any kind of victory is possible. They're just kind of trying to hang on until it ends. But when we see enough inspiring movies, it causes us to reflect on a higher plane, and then the hope dawns in us that we can not only be relieved of suffering, but we can actually rise to love and bliss. Now, isn't that kind of a dividing line in our lives? I mean, a dividing line in the world between those who seek God and those who don't. Master once said, or someone said, there's just two people in the world, the people who are looking for God and the people who aren't. And looking for God means that there's this hope somewhere in your consciousness that there's really a high reality, that not only that like someday we might end up there, but that we can actually transcend into that. I'm interested in the fact because my name is Asha, and Asha means hope. And he puts hope as a very critical place here. The hope dawns on us that this might be true. Because once you have the hope that that's true, then all of a sudden you begin to put energy behind that, don't we? If the cause is hopeless, we no longer put any energy into it. But as long as there's a hope that this might be true, we'll continue to persevere. So we'll get up and do our kriyas again. We'll struggle one more time to have a right attitude. We just won't give in to bitterness. And we won't allow the complaints of the body to conquer us because we still hope that by putting out a certain energy, something will happen. And Master says this is the process of the movies. They entertain, they instruct us, they depress us, and then that causes us to think a little bit. Because when we're sad, we often get more serious. And then inspiration touches in. He says also, the movies that life plays for us of other people's sufferings affect us, but their impact on us is diminished by our own relative lack of involvement in them. So we can be touched by other people's stories, but not quite as much as we are by our own. We may shed a passing tear, but the pain will be slight compared to the sufferings we experience in our own lives. Isn't that an embarrassingly true statement? You know? And like, what is the big difference? That it happened to you or it happened to me? Well, of course, the difference is that it happened to me. But all of this is because it's tied to that post of ego. It's because things that happen to me concern me personally. And that's why, especially in this new renunciate order, and in all that Swami's been talking about lately, the whole emphasis is to dissolve that sense of I. And not just, as he puts it, in previous days, we tried to get at the ego indirectly by taking away from it the things it enjoyed. Comfort, fame, name, all of those different things, pleasures of all kinds. We removed those in the hope that it would weaken the ego itself. But peculiarly, it won't necessarily. I mean, you can deprive yourself of everything, and all you have is this really forceful, sort of fanatical ego still. That's where devotion becomes everything. Because if you exercise self-discipline, but you also have devotion, the mere act of devotion, as soon as you include another reality in your circle of love, then all of a sudden the willingness to do things for the sake of a reality other than yourself begins to surface. That's what, the whole process, which life is so much about human love, because in the act of human love, we're willing to sacrifice our own comforts for the sake of someone else. And in the act of doing that, we begin to discover the pleasure of doing that as a principle. And once we begin to discover the pleasure of acting for the interests of others against our own interests, that's the highest, most enjoyable principle there is, then gradually that becomes a motivation in itself. And that's where the whole process of renunciation comes from. I was reflecting on it recently, just thinking about one thing or another that one might be asked to give up, or that I myself might give up, and there was a little bit of a twinge. Oh, but what would life be like if I didn't have that? There's a little bit of a thought. And then this resurging memory. But every time we act for a larger interest than just the ego, don't we always feel so wonderful about it? So what makes one even flinch for a second? Why would we even imagine that any sense of deprivation would be there, when really what we're doing is we're defining ourselves by something so much bigger? And you see, that's all of our suffering and our intense vulnerability comes because we have defined ourselves by something so limited, and limitation itself, as Master writes here earlier, I quoted it last week, limitation itself is the cause of our suffering. We suffer because in some way we feel limited. I'm limited because I don't have this. I'm limited because I can't acquire that. I'm limited because I'm not able to do this. It's always because we have this boundary that we hit up against when we see that there's something on the other side of that boundary that would be desirable. So of course, if we can dissolve those boundaries, then all of our suffering ceases. And it's just, so many times in life one thinks, time and again, circumstances that we do not at first imagine to be for our benefit turn out to be for our benefit. And things that we think are going wrong, and sooner or later we see that they haven't gone wrong at all. They've gone just the way they had to go, even if they were challenging along the way. I often wonder, and I don't know that my parents have enough consciousness, but they had some hard years at the end. But I often wonder, what do those years look like after you're out of your body? If you have, like my uncle is having, these years of rapidly diminishing mental acuity after having had a very intellectual and educated life, is there a moment somewhere in the life review where you say, oh yes, I see how that had to happen? I mean, I can certainly imagine what his lessons might be. In the case of my father who's passed away, my father allowed a kind of Virgo pickiness, is the only word I can think of. He began to feel obligated to be very, very picky about things. And it wasn't as much fun to be around him because he was always picky about something. But then he lost his mind, and he just wasn't able to sort of hold all that together anymore. And what he reverted to was this very childlike sweetness. And he became so much happier when he forgot what he was supposed to be upset about. So when he passed out of his body, did he see that lesson? I just read something this evening that Swami wrote in the context of something or another, where he wrote, he was imagining a dialogue between himself and his mother, and his mother explaining to him how someday you'll grow up and be a big man. And he said, well, I don't particularly want to be a grown-up. I like being a child. And then he used the phrase, being a child seems more natural, which I was really contemplating that. In other words, the spirit of childhood seemed more natural to him than the egoic self-importance that he perceived in the adults around him. Now, of course, that was extremely deep spiritual perception, isn't it? Because what he was perceiving is all that, the ego. Just like before, at a very young age, before the ego has a hold, Swami used to always has written about, he lived in Romania, grew up in Romania in a small little enclave of workers for the Esso Oil Corporation, mostly English and American. A very small community when I really talked to him about it, 20 families or so, maybe 24 families, just 10 children or less than that, just a very small group of people, very isolated. And he was the oldest child, and when he's been willing to be more frank about it, his consciousness essentially defined all the children, because he was the natural leader, and so they all followed his lead. And he was very imaginative and very joyful and very childlike. And then he said at a certain point, a few other families came, and there were boys in those families who challenged his leadership. And he said, and they had that American ego, which kind of likes to strut around and talk about how important it is. And these boys young boys, children still, but they kind of played the slightly cynical, big, powerful kid kind of thing. And it sucked the other children into it. And Swamiji was just totally not interested anymore, because the childlikeness had gone out of being children. But isn't that what happens to us as adults? So Master backs us up here and wants us to just look at it as a movie. And as I was starting to say, it works out. My latest phrase is not even that it will work out, but that something will happen. Something always happens. Even if we just sit here, we will gradually get older and years will pass. Even if we don't participate in our own life, eventually, we'll be 15 years older, because something always happens. Time doesn't stop. And we get so engaged on what has to happen and what can't happen. But I find it helpful just to think, don't worry, because something will always happen. It will just roll along. Anything that gets us out of that is a good idea. Swamiji says, we should approach tragedy, whether in others or in our own lives, with an attitude of dynamic inner joy. The way to emerge from suffering is to raise to a higher level our own or other people's consciousness. For ourselves, consciousness can be raised by right attitudes. Now, that's, everything about life is either escaping suffering or going toward bliss, isn't it? He said the only way that we can escape suffering is to raise our consciousness. To raise your consciousness means to become aware of a higher level of reality than the one we're just watching. I mean, we have our friend Jason, whose body has really begun to fail, and so he's living in a reality in which his body is no longer working for him. He can no longer walk around and do the things he used to do. He can't talk and think and reason and argue and read, do all the things that he used to do. So there's a natural inclination to feel suffering because of that, isn't there? I'm not who I used to be. I can't do what I used to do. I remember a woman friend of mine, Karen, when she was dying. I wasn't there, but someone else told me about this incident. She was lying with her head in a very awkward position, and her friend who was visiting her said, "Why don't you lift your head? It looks so uncomfortable." And she sort of looked over and said, "You have no idea how much energy it takes to lift my head." We just take it for granted. I'll lift my head. Oh, I'll just move my head like this. But the body stops working. And, this other woman I went to visit in the hospital, she was dying of AIDS, and, she said she just couldn't find her arms anymore. She just didn't know where they were. They just ceased to be part of her body. She could sort of see them, but she couldn't, really bring them into her realm of influence anymore, except just occasionally. She was perfectly cheerful about it because she had raised her consciousness to a higher level. She was just watching the body fail, but her entire orientation was that she was on her way to the astral world. And it was almost like literally, I don't think she was even actually truthfully in a state of grace, but she just shifted her attention. Her attention was no longer looking backwards at the body was failing. She heightened her awareness to look forward to where her body was going, where her consciousness was going. That's always the end of suffering, isn't it? Whether you're writing your autobiography and putting this into a chapter, whether you're meditating deeply and transcending. I made reference to that woman from Rwanda. In her book, Left to Tell, which if you haven't read, you might, it's really good. She was hidden for 91 days, along with 7 other women, in a very small bathroom. A room, she said, was about 4 feet by 3 feet, I think is what, that seems impossibly small, but it was very small, and there were 7 women in there, and they were there for 91 days. And there were people they could hear racing around the house, even sometimes actually literally saying their names looking for them, because they knew they were hidden somewhere. And they couldn't talk, they could barely move, and she had a rosary, and she was a very spiritual person. She basically, after a while, just went into a state of prayer, which she stayed in almost continuously for all those days. Just completely transcended the situation, and of course came out enormously transformed by that, by an experience that could easily break someone. What is the end to suffering? You have to raise your consciousness. So now all of these whispers that he's giving us are telling us how to raise our consciousness. I care not what happens to me as long as I can remember God. Now that's really lifting our consciousness up above. The other one that we read that we liked so much, number 112, that through the pores of the sky, God smiles at me. In the twinkling, God's looking at me. God beholds me. In the twinkling of the stars, He smiles at me. I draw strength from the sun, and the moon calms my feelings. This one doesn't begin with a state of suffering, but this is telling us how to raise our consciousness. There's 2 ways to deal with something that troubles us. We can either approach directly into that problem and try to figure out a way to guide that problem to a higher understanding. Or, in the case of that particular one, we just go somewhere else and just look at another reality in which this reality becomes less. The way to overcome, to emerge from suffering, it's a very interesting phrase, is to raise the level of our own or others' awareness. And then he says it again, the fundamental cure for all human ills is everywhere one and the same, to raise one's consciousness. I find it's very helpful on the spiritual path to have generic solutions. You know, it's partly because the tendency to personalize our karma causes us to think that we have to understand all these different things, and we have to know this, and we have to see how this is going to work out, and we have to see why that's happening, and all this different stuff, where the fact of the matter is, all we have to do is raise our consciousness. Because once you raise your consciousness, not only do you not need to know, you don't even care. Because the suffering only exists when one is self-concerned enough to experience what's happening as suffering because it's something other than what I want. But when you get a slightly higher level, you realize everything is happening within the will of God, so why would I even want this to be different? How do I even know where this story is going? That's the most interesting thing. How do I know how this story is supposed to end? Where do we get the idea of how this story is supposed to end? Where do we get the idea of what this is supposed to be like for me? That I'm supposed to live to a ripe old age, that I'm never supposed to be hungry, that things are not supposed to be difficult for me? I mean, like, who wrote that script? It's a very different movie than the one that we think we're writing. Okay, let me just see if there's any other thoughts here, and then we'll go on. Here's another one I like. This is just one line. Our troubles usually arise from not knowing what part we are meant to play. How can one know what God wants? And then he goes on to talk about that. People only suffer because they think things ought to be different from what they are. If you're watching a movie and the movie's happening, I mean, you don't think, this movie shouldn't be like this. No. Don't you understand? There should be a whole bunch of different actors here, and the heroine should be much prettier, and I really don't like that one over there, and this whole business of taking place where it's, you know, in this cold weather climate, this whole thing should be happening in a tropical island. You know, you just sort of, you stand up in a movie and you start announcing how it's supposed to be. But isn't that exactly what we're doing? The movie starts running, and the great director has written the script, and the film is already in the can, too. It's already finished. The film is in the can. Isn't that an archaic expression from when they actually did put the film in the can? But it's already finished because the trajectory of our karma is there, and we stand up in the middle and declare it. This is what I was talking about last week, where we're asking God for prayers that are against His own law and cannot possibly be answered. And so we ourselves, by our karmic efforts, have brought ourselves exactly to this point, and then we want it to be different. That was, again, I learned so much from the last years of my parents' life. And I've shared this a little, but it's relevant to this point. When I really stood back and realized that, you know, at the age of 80-something, that my parents had ended up exactly where they were meant to be because they had walked themselves inch by inch into those exact situations. And there was so much in my heart at that moment, resistance to the situations they were in. But I realized this is just crazy because they made endless decisions over and over and over again that brought them exactly to here. And then I'm going to sort of stand at that point. I mean, where would I unravel it? That's the most interesting thing when you start wanting it to be different. Where would you unravel it? At what point would you sort of roll it back to? And how much would you have to take apart to make that happen? So far better to go forward with all these things that Master says. You know, all of this comes down to also thinking about the 8-hour meditation. One of the most enjoyable things about the 8-hour meditation, at least for me always, it's less so true since I had laser surgery on my eyes and I can now see at a distance. But before, when I had contact lenses or glasses, once I took my contact lenses or glasses out, I couldn't see anything. I couldn't really see who was in the room, and I absolutely could not see the clock. Just absolutely out of the question. I'd never had any idea what time it was. I could tell light and shadow. I wasn't that blind, you know. But I just loved taking off my watch and really in disciplining myself not to look at the clock because I don't have any responsibilities. I don't run that meditation. And every time the slightest, you know, sort of unease comes in, just think to myself, Asha, there's absolutely nothing else you can do. I mean, you're here. You're not going anywhere. Of course, I'm trapped in the front, so it's harder for me. Maybe some of you can wander off. I can't just say, oh, I think, 2.5 hours is enough. I think I'll just go out and go Christmas shopping. It's a little harder for me to do that, so maybe I am more trapped than you. But, you're pretty trapped too. There's nothing you can do. So it's such a wonderful thing to just realize how many layers of entering into the now are possible. And how profoundly, once one enters completely into the now, what is there to be discontent about? Discontent has to have a past and a future. Because discontent, by its definition, wants things to be other than they are. Jyotish once gave a wonderful sermon on Jesus' statement, "For this hour was I born." And he looked at all of us and he said, and, wherever you're standing, for this hour you were born. Meaning that all of your lifetimes you've worked hard to get right to here. So it's just a movie anyway. It's only going to take 2 hours. I think the 8-hour meditation in 2009 will probably last about 4 seconds, maybe 10, in the greater scheme of things. Not that we have anxiety about it, I don't mean it that way, but it's a great day to really practice a whole lot of spiritual attitudes because we have nothing else to do. Okay, any questions or comments or thoughts before I go on with some poems here? I thought I might run through, because it seems like an obvious thing to run through. Come to me, O Christ, as the divine shepherd of souls. Doesn't that seem like a nice idea? Swamiji's been speaking more forcefully recently about his growing conviction that in a previous lifetime, that Jesus was in fact Yogananda in a previous lifetime, that it was the same soul. He won't declare it. He leaves this little space for it. But it's just an interesting thought, especially Master called his teaching the second coming of Christ. I mean, let's just call that a big hint. But I sort of asked Swamiji, why didn't Master say more about it? Oh, Swami said, it wasn't time. Think of the difficulty he had anyway if he declared himself as a reincarnation of Jesus. Can you imagine? Just would have been, he might have been assassinated. There's just no hope. Yes?
But didn't he on some occasions say that he was visited by Christ? I mean, I guess it's just abstract.
Well, it's just, what the question was, didn't Master say that he had visions of Christ? Yeah, he did. He had visions of, but you don't know when Master was speaking what he was speaking of. Did he have a visitation of Christ, or did he have a memory of that past life? Master won't claim it. Master's answer to the question is, what difference would it make? Which is a marvelously adept. It's not important. I'm not trying to prove the point. But the reason it becomes relevant and interesting is we often think of Jesus as being very distant from us, but we have the example of the vibration of Master. And if we even imagined that there was a unity of those two consciousnesses, it gives us a certain access into Christ. Because what you really want to do with the teaching of Christ is to make him real. And I don't just mean real in vibration, but his teaching, his life was so much his teaching that the more you can really see that life happening in front of your eyes, the more powerfully you can, and you'd see the disciples interacting, the more you can become one of them. Because it helps us more if we see those stories as happening, those potentially happening to us. And that's what, because then our reactions become more integrated into those stories. Instead of it just being parables and images, it becomes, what would I do? What would I do if Jesus actually turned to me and said, will you also leave me? What would we do if we're sitting across the table and Jesus says, one of you will betray me? How would I feel? What would I do if Mary Magdalene comes in and starts washing Jesus' feet with costly ointment and washing his feet with her tears and drying his feet with her hair? If we were, I always say to you, if Swamiji were sitting up here at one of our satsangs and somebody comes in and throws herself at his feet and starts washing his feet, and he allows it to happen. I mean, how would we inwardly react? Would we be inspired? Would we be repelled? Would we have the nerve to do it? They're wonderful questions. When Jesus is washing the feet of his disciples at the Last Supper, and Peter says, "Sir, I mean, how can I have you wash my feet? If Master comes and kneels in front of you and wants to wash your feet, how would you respond? Would you have the courage to accept whatever he brings to you?" And that's when Jesus said to Peter, Peter said, "I can't let you do it." And he says, "If you don't let me do it, you're no disciple of mine." And then so Peter answers, "Well then, Lord, not only my feet, but my hands and my head," which you just absolutely love. Just, okay then, whatever you ask of me. That's what it always is. And we think, well, we make a list of what we think he's going to ask of us. But of course, that's not ever what they ask. They always ask something completely unexpected, because the stuff that we've lined up is the stuff we're ready to hand over. It's the stuff that we didn't even know. You know, like Sister Gyanamata said, why do I have to give up even those things that are, I love the phrase, that are mine by right, that harm no one? Why do you want those things from me? Because they define who we are. Okay. Come to me, O Christ, as the divine shepherd of souls. O Christ, thou rarest flower of hearts, thou didst sail the storm-tossed lake of prejudiced minds. So you define right away, you know, Jesus did not take on an easy incarnation. He had a gentle heart, and he came to an environment in which everything was stacked against him right from the start. So all of us who feel like our lot in life is a little tough, we realize we have a real companion in this respect. Its evil-scented, gloomy thought waves lashed thy lily-tender soul. So nobody had it easy. They crucified thee with their evil, yet didst thou shed on them the aroma of goodness and forgiveness, and help them to be purified by remorse, to make them attractively sweet-scented with thine all-loving soul flower. So we have all kinds of things here. We have the picture that Jesus took on an extremely difficult incarnation, and that it was hard for him in the sense that he had a tender heart. He wasn't indifferent to all that was going on, but he raised his consciousness. It doesn't say that, but that's what they did. And then he was able to give to those who were mistreating him goodness and forgiveness, and he helped them to be purified. In other words, he allowed them to act out their evil ways, but by his response, the contrast of his response awoke in them a realization of their error. And you know, that's what the presence of God does within us even now, is that when we transgress against our own consciousness of that inner goodness, we feel the contrast and we feel remorse. Isn't that so? And so that's what the living presence of God does within us even now. If it weren't for that living presence, what would we measure ourselves against? And why would we ever realize that we were off from where we ought to be? O thou great lover of all error-torn brothers. You know, Jesus came for people who make big mistakes. I mean, his whole mission was set up that people were going to make a tremendous error in regard to him. And yet he really came to help those who were confused. That's worth saying, because one of the things he says is, sure, you can love those who love you. You know, even the tax collectors do that. But to love those who hate you and despise you and scornfully use you, that's real spiritual greatness. An unseen monument of the mightiest miracle of love was established in every heart when the magic of thy voice uttered the words, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Those amazing words, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," were spoken by Christ when he was hanging on the cross, being crucified, looking at those who had done this to him. You know, in that moment when, by any egoically based reckoning, he was at the point of the greatest abuse, the most suffering, the most mistreatment, and his thought, forgive them, who was he asking to forgive them? He was asking the Heavenly Father to forgive them. In other words, what he was looking at I mean, it's such an extraordinary image of everything that we're talking about in terms of not being engaged with one's own destiny because one is filled with love for others. So he's there, he's dying on the cross. The traditional interpretation of that is how much suffering that is and that all that suffering redeemed us and so on. Yogananda's interpretation, of course, Master's interpretation, is that he was so far beyond physical suffering, he was just offering his body to work out karma for his disciples, true, but not because he had to suffer, because the end of all, you emerge from suffering by raising your consciousness. His consciousness was so far outside of his body that yes, it was happening, and he was able to feel it if he wanted to, but even if he felt it, it was such a non-relevant aspect to his nature. But he looks and he sees those who have put him in this position, and he knows the terrible karmic consequence of what they've done. Because to have an avatar come to you and have you not only not accept the teaching that master has come to give you, but to actively do your best to destroy that teaching and that master, I mean, you can hardly even comprehend it. So Jesus is watching that play out. And so when he prays to the Father to forgive them, I mean, God is not a vengeful person, who's like going to put them in jail. It's the forgiveness is the inevitable acting out of the karmic law. And so Jesus is, by his statement, is trying to intervene into that karmic process and saying, they have no idea the difficulty that they're causing themselves. May they be spared because of their ignorance. But it's so, in and of itself, the magnitude of the spiritual greatness implied by that, and the challenge, just for our little pettinesses, to be able to imitate Christ in that respect. That's why he says, an unseen monument of the mightiest miracle of love was established, he says, in every heart when the magic of thy voice uttered, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's the example of the unconditional nature of divine love. It's just breathtaking. Thou hast healed the cataract of hatred. We have now grown to see thy truth. Love thine enemies as thyself, for they are thy brothers, though sick and sleeping. I love the way Master declares this as a fact. Thou hast healed the cataract of hatred. It's like the divine force that Jesus set in place will inevitably bear fruit. That hatred will not be able to stand up against the example of divine love that you've put forward. When? Well, that's the longer question. But the divine fact is, remember in the samadhi poem, vanish the veils of light and shade. There's only light and that which blocks the light. So Jesus put out an absolute light here, and that it's been healed. Now we know that we love our enemies, for they are thy brothers, though sick and sleeping. Thou hast taught us not to increase their fevered blows of hatred with the bludgeons of revenge. Master's language is so vivid. Thine undying sympathy has inspired us to heal our brothers, suffering in their delirium of anger, with the soothing salve of divine forgiveness. And again, you see, this is an affirmation. Thy sympathy has inspired us to behave as you have behaved. And so when you read this, you're not really reading about Jesus. You're talking about who I have become, who we have become, because of his divine example and the power of it. So we're challenged by this to make those words true. Thy crucifixion reminds us of the daily crucifixion of our own fortitude by trials, of our wisdom by ignorance, of our self-control by what Master calls the scathing touch of temptation, and of our love by misunderstanding. So Jesus' body was crucified, which was no test for him, and it reminds us of the real test that we have to face, our fortitude by trials. Things are coming to us that we wish weren't coming to us. This is too much difficulty. This is too hard. And so our fortitude, which is our strength to persevere with dynamic energy, is tested by the sheer necessity to have to act it out day after day after day. It's like I told you with my great embarrassment how I once said to Swami that life would be so much easier if it weren't so hard. And how he deigned not at all to answer me, period. Because our fortitude is tested. And our wisdom by ignorance, by the ignorance of others and by our own, our self-control by the scathing touch of temptation. I love that Master's so real, isn't it? You know, there's none of this, well, now that you've seen God, you're never going to be tempted again. The scathing touch of temptation. And that's the crucifixion that we face is, I want to go this way, but I need to go in another direction. Everything is pulling me in this way, but I must resist. And he just assumes that's going to be our daily experience. So we have to take that seriously and not think there's anything wrong. I mean, it's not merely the effort, but people become so persuaded there must be something wrong with me. But he's telling us it's just the way it is. And of our love by misunderstanding. We have such a deep desire for people to understand us, don't we? We get so upset when our spouse doesn't understand us, when other people don't understand us. Just what happens. Thy test on the cross proved the victory of divine wisdom over ignorance, of thy divine soul over flesh, of thy happiness over pain, and of thy love over hatred. So Master's just simply declaring what his consciousness was. That's what he was experiencing. So are we heartened to bear our own crosses bravely and with faith. By your example, teach us, when we are crucified by harshness, to pour out only sweetness, to bear with calmness the assaults of worry, and to give understanding unceasingly to those who unjustly hate us. Many places in the movie essay, Master repeats, accept it calmly. You can deal with it if you're calm. Just think about calmness. I mean, I'm an excitable person, and calmness is not something that has come easy to me. But just every single time that something happens, and I get excited about it. Somebody tells me a story of a certain injustice, and I get all upset about it. Somebody comes in for counseling, and they're a married person, and they tell me only their side of the story, and I get all excited about it. You know, or I read about some economic event that might cause trouble, and I get all excited about it. And invariably, then there's the time when we come back to a centered state of calmness, and we realize that the actions and the decisions we were making when we weren't calm were never going to be as good as if we face it calmly. O shepherd of souls, wandering hearts are seeking of themselves the one fold of divine devotion. We have heard the ever-calling music of thy infinite kindness. In the oratorio, there's that beautiful line, he coaxed them by kindness. And that's how Jesus did it. Kindness is such a beautiful quality. Our one desire is to find our home in thee, to receive the cosmic Father with the joyous open eyes of wisdom, and to know that all of us are sons of our own one God. Teach us to conquer the Satan of dividing selfishness, which prevents the gathering of all our brothers' souls into the one fold of spirit. Calling to one another by the watchword, love him who loves you, and love all who love you not, let us rally beneath the canopy of the universal oneness of the Christ. Amen. You know, here it's so sweet because what Master does is he describes all the great virtues that Jesus manifested. And when we're calling to Christ to come to us, what he has us do is he calls to the list of all those virtues and calls those virtues to be our own virtues. And that's how we call Christ to us. Isn't that interesting? He puts one invocation to Christ, and that's what it is, of the greatness of his forgiving heart and his kindness and his wisdom and his courage in the face of trials. And that's what it is, to be in tune with Christ, that we can all rally beneath the canopy of the universal oneness of the Christ. Amen, he says. All right, let's take a short break here. Enjoyable beyond imagination of expectancy, samadhi bliss. That's where we got to last week. Okay, and I'm reading it through for the meaning and for the feeling of it, so that one, it'll help you to memorize it, and two, if you have memorized it, you can spin out on the many levels of this glorious poem, and it helps you so much. So now he's gotten us to the point where we've entered the state of samadhi, and then he starts speaking about what the experience is. This is what I called the experience of the I. This is the section. Not a mental chloroform, he says, or unconscious state without willful return. You know, he's answering those people who think that when you expand into cosmic consciousness, because you're not relating to the world around you, that somehow you're less aware. You know, it's not a state where you've dulled your awareness, not a mental chloroform, he calls it, or unconscious state without willful return. Samadhi but extends my conscious realm beyond the limits of the mortal frame to farthest boundary of eternity. Every time I say that within myself, you see, our conscious realm usually is just really defined by our body, isn't it? This is as far as our consciousness reaches, and as Swami often points out, we're not even really omnipresent in our own bodies. Because the ego is centered in the medulla, we look out through this portion, and this is where our consciousness is centered. We don't tend to know about our feet as much as we know what's happening close around our head. We don't know about our ribs. This is that's where the energization exercises make an effort for us to be conscious in all parts of our bodies. So what we're exercising with the energization exercises, which is why they don't really work unless we're concentrating on them. They're not aerobics. But what we're doing is we're tensing, the right calf muscle. And just by consciously tensing the right calf muscle, which all of you can try, as I am trying, just even as I say it, then all of a sudden, one realizes that the calf muscle was just sort of floating out there, but all of a sudden I put conscious will into it. So we're at least trying to become, if not omnipresent, at least more present in our mortal frame, because we don't even really know what's going on in our own body. What to speak of being individually conscious of all the cells and all the millions of little things that are happening here. But samadhi extends my conscious realm even beyond the limits of this physical body to the farthest boundary of eternity. When I'm often saying this, sitting in meditation, beyond limits of the mortal frame, and even as you sit in meditation and your body is still, you can sort of see your little body just sitting there, to farthest boundaries of eternity. And then without any physical movement, just that mere thought of casting your consciousness out so far. This is why repeating this poem in meditation often makes your meditation so much deeper afterwards. To farthest boundary of eternity. Of course, eternity has no boundary, but the boundary of eternity, just where can you go to reach that? It's so marvelous. And then he tells you what's going on out there, where I, the cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me. Isn't that just the most charming image? The I now is not the mortal frame. The I now is stretching out to infinity. And we watch the little ego floating in me. The little tiny mortal frame. Usually my little ego is a little cross-legged little person, because that's how I often meditate. So the little cross-legged person, this Swami Shankarananda, he, Rishikesh Swami, Indian Swami, I was with him doing something or another, and he had his computer open. Just to describe this Swami, we were in the car together, I was driving him. And he's telling me about how we can't possibly be good yogis because we don't know Sanskrit. He'll send somebody from his ashram over to our ashram and he'll teach us Sanskrit. We can't really be yogis without Sanskrit. We have to send somebody from Rishikesh to teach us Sanskrit. He wants to make a phone call and his phone isn't working. I hand him mine. He looks at it and he said, "Such an old phone." Just like, he was so incredibly scornful of my lack of technology. Well, that's really amused me. When I teased him back, what a ridiculous combination of qualities you are. But but he had his little cursor. It was a little meditating yogi. On his computer, the cursor that moved around was a little lotus posture yogi. Somebody had drawn for him, and it just moved all over. And really, sometimes the I, the cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me. I almost invariably see that little, something that looks a great deal like that little yogi. And it just floats, because you know if you're in the lotus posture or in the fish pose, you're supposedly be able to float on the water. Like Rajasi would go into the lotus. Is that the fish pose? Is that the one? Yeah, when you were in the lotus posture and leaning back. He would float on the ocean, apparently. So I always see the little meditating yogi floating on the cosmic sea. And it's just slightly comical, because the whole phrase, where I, the cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me, it's a very whimsical phrase. So I like to make it whimsical, because you exaggerate these things, and then later on, when you're about to take yourself really seriously, and you just remember that you're just the little ego floating on the cosmic sea, that little tiny cartoon figure really helps. And then he just goes into this. The sparrow, each grain of sand, fall not without my sight. One of my favorite stories in the book I wrote about Swami, one of my absolute favorites, it's from Nalini. And she says, my life will not be writ large on the pages of history. Mine has been a small life. But Master says even the sparrow is watched by God. And to know that no matter how, there's sparrows, it's like the most common bird you can think of. No bird watcher puts it down when his very first bird he ever sees, he writes on his list is the sparrow. But God watches that. No sparrow, no grain of sand, sand. You can't even see a grain of sand. And yet the infinite consciousness permeates all of that. And it just takes all of our tiny little pictures of reality and turns them on their head. All space like an iceberg floats within my mental sea. These are these same images of the ocean. And then the little bits of things. Colossal container eye of all things made. I always love that. I try to decide whether I'm a milk carton, or perhaps a can, or maybe just a giant Ziploc bag. Colossal container eye of all things made. It's just like God has a sense of humor too. Steve Martin wrote a humorous essay about there's a hell where the inventor of the shrink wrap for CD covers has to sit there and open CD covers for all eternity. That's what he has to do. And in heaven, there's a high place in heaven also for the inventor of the milk carton and the banana, because they're such perfect packages. So every time I say colossal container, those images come to me, because it always makes me smile. By deeper, longer, thirsty. What a phrase. Deeper, longer, thirsty. Guru-given meditation comes this celestial samadhi. That one always brings me back to earth, because, deeper, longer, thirsty, a little bit of hard work. I also remember this because colossal container, then I like to think that I'm inside the Guru, because the next line after container speaks of the Guru. By deeper, longer, thirsty. Then that fantastic hyphenated word, Guru-given meditation. Here we think so much that we're doing this ourselves. We put out all the effort we possibly can. The end result of all that effort is that we purify our heart sufficiently that the grace that has been trying to reach us all the time is finally not blocked. And that's all that happens. Deeper, longer, thirsty, hardworking, then the grace of God comes. So when you're reciting it really thoughtfully, by deeper, longer, thirsty, there I am. Guru-given meditation. So sweet. Comes this celestial samadhi. Celeste is, a woman's name. Celestial is such a beautiful word in itself, isn't it? It's celestial. It's like it's an onomatopoeia. It sounds like what it is. comes this celestial samadhi. Then we move into another section here. Mobile murmurs of atoms are heard, and then I always sort of hear this like rebellion starting in the earth, that these atoms are really tired of being held together and they're just about ready to dissolve back into something else. And so this kind of muttering starts down there. But it's, this is like, isn't it fun? The whole world is coming to pieces. I think Master had fun writing this. Mobile murmurs, they're just beginning to move. The atoms, you're beginning to hear the atoms shifting around. The dark earth, mountains, veils. Lo, he points out, they're molten liquid. They've started to move. Matter's beginning to dissolve, you see. The atoms are beginning to shift. And then what we think of as mountains and the whole earth, it's not solid at all. It's turned into molten liquid. And this is a stage, it's not like water yet, it's lava flowing. Like lava flows, it's somewhere between a solid and a liquid. It's molten. And then flowing seas change into vapors of nebulae. So this molten liquid, the whole world is beginning to change into this moving ocean of not quite matter anymore. And then it changes again into more subtle vapors of nebulae, which I'm not really quite sure what it means, but you know that it's getting more ethereal. And then Om, the sound of Om blows upon the vapors, and then it opens up the illusion of matter, opening wondrously their veils. So you follow that progression. Mobile murmurs of atoms are heard, the dark earth, mountains, veils, lo, it's molten liquid. And then flowing seas that are moving change even more subtle. They become vapors, and then the Om sound comes and it blows it all away, and it opens. The illusion of matter is broken. Oceans stand revealed, and what we see, that those oceans are nothing but shining electrons, the great secret. See, that goes back up to the mobile murmurs of atoms were heard, and now we're seeing the electrons within the atoms. And then till, at last sound of the cosmic drum, which of course is the Om is beating away here, vanish even these grosser lights, even the shining electrons are blown away by the Om, and they become eternal rays of all-pervading bliss. So we've started with mobile murmurs of atoms, which begin to shift and become liquid. That liquid moves into vapor. The Om affects the vapor. The curtain parts. We see that it's nothing but shining electrons, but the Om continues. We keep hearing the Om. We keep getting deeper into the Om until even electrons have vanished. And it all becomes eternal rays of all-pervading bliss. Every one of those words, you can just really go into those. All-pervading. There's just nowhere that it isn't. And then we just declare, because now here we are. From joy I came, for joy I live, in sacred joy I melt. We've made it through the mobile murmurs of atoms, all the way to the eternal rays of all-pervading bliss. So then there I am. And because something is melted, I can now take a drink out of it. This is my little memory tricks. In sacred joy I melt. So now I've melted into this ocean of mind. It's all liquid. I drink all creation's waves. The waves of creation are all that sense of individuality, and that's all duality. So all the duality is just sucked back in, because the ocean can exist without those waves. So let's just get rid of all those waves. We'll just take them all back in. Ocean of mind, I drink all creation's waves. And then all aspects of creation, 4 veils, solid, liquid, vapor, light, it all lifts, lift aright. Ocean of mind, I drink all creation's waves, 4 veils of solid, liquid, vapor, light, lift aright. I'm just taking it all away now. I kind of had it with this whole creation stuff. Then myself in everything enters the great myself. You see, this is creation rolling back. I've been out there in all of this infinite world, but all the veils, solid, liquid, vapor, light, it's all gone away, and the essence of myself just withdraws back into the infinite great myself. Then I love this part. Gone forever, fitful, flickering shadows of mortal memory. See, earlier, the creation subconsciously lurks, ready to invade my newly wakened memory divine. It was there in the earlier section. But now that the mobile murmurs of atoms have been heard and Om is blown across, now gone forever. Fitful, flickering shadows. It just seems like such an insignificant force, doesn't it? You know Swamiji's beautiful song, Where Has My Love Gone? It has that line. Strange how when love calls, memory stays, calling across the tides of our days. What that verse means is that even when divine love calls us, even when we know about divine love, this human memory still lingers and makes us unsettled. That's what that's about. That's why we've lost, that song is about where is she? I'm searching everywhere for my divine sweetheart. Where is she gone? Because we had this wonderful romance. We loved one another, but now I've lost her. And then he reflects, strange, even in that infinite love, the memory of my mortal self called me. And that's, of course, what brought the shadow between himself and the divine. And now he has to be, here by my bed she left me a note. Can you explain the words that she wrote? Seek me, she said, love, out on the sea. Boundless the reaches of true love must be. That mortal, that memory of the human, puts a boundary on it again. But now, at the end of the poem Samadhi, it says, gone forever, fitful, flickering shadows of mortal memory. I like to just say that line over and over and think, wouldn't that be something? That it's just completely wiped out. There's just no mortal memory left. I'm just one with eternity. So then we just really roll home. Spotless is my mental sky. And then we go below, ahead, and high above. That's subconscious, conscious, and superconscious. And it's really below, you lower your eyes, ahead, straight forward, and high above. Spotless is my mental sky. There's nothing in my consciousness, not any dimension of my consciousness. It's all gone. Because I have, ocean of mind has drunk all of creation's waves. So spotless is my mental sky. There's just nothing left. Every time I say below, below, ahead, and high above, I remember the exercises of Swami to take us through those states. And I also think, gee, nothing in my subconscious, that everything has become perfectly resolved and integrated. And there's no secrets, there's no memories, there's no holding on, there's no unresolved desires. Spotless is my mental sky. Beautiful image. And so then, eternity and I, one united ray. There's nothing left. And then this, of course, the best line of all. A tiny bubble of laughter. I am become the sea of mirth itself. I mean, that is the last lines of his poem called Samadhi. I mean, when you merge into the infinite, you become the sea of mirth. And you are a tiny bubble of laughter. Is how much more both homely in the English sense of just right here where I live, I'm a tiny bubble of laughter. And God is the infinite sea of mirth. How can that be a greater contrast to the way we normally live? Anything but. And then I'm sure many of you have heard Master's voice on that tape, where he says it, a tiny bubble of laughter, I am become the sea of mirth. Say it again and again. Say it again and again, a tiny bubble of laughter. I am become the sea of mirth itself. And my little tiny yogi, sort of bounces around. Just a tiny bubble of laughter. I love to think of myself too. I've always been sort of a small person, so this always suits me. But I love to just make my self-image a tiny bubble of laughter. We try so hard to be so important. We think we matter so much. And when it's all over, the tiny bubble of laughter becomes the sea of mirth. What is the big to-do? Isn't it glorious? So Master says, memorize my poem Samadhi and recite it every day. and you can see why. So, great souls, thus ends 3 classes on Whispers from Eternity.